Thanks for clicking on to the Saturday edition of Vogan's European Outlook. I have a little bit of a medium to long range outlook in today's video because we are edging ever closer to meteorological autumn season, and of course sea surface temperatures play a significant role as we go into the month of September and through October and of course November in terms of the atmosphere. So, a lot of warm water as expected, and as already stated many times over on this channel, we have got a lot of warmth stacked up across the northern ocean basins of the Pacific and indeed the Atlantic. And, no surprise that the overall summer has been high pressure dominated, bringing not only dry conditions but also unseasonably warm conditions through much of the summer season. So, therefore, you would slightly tend to hint towards a warmer autumn season coming up, and even potentially into the early portion of winter itself as well, because when you do have very, very warm waters, that tends to take the sting out of any cold. That being said, however, it is not simple in any stretch of the imagination, and it is going to be a very interesting upcoming couple of months, because the grand scheme of things through 2022 has been warm and predominantly drier than normal across the UK and across the majority of Western Europe and indeed Europe overall. But before I get into today's video, I want to talk about Mr. Gavin Partridge. Terrific videos he produces on a daily basis. I do encourage you to check out his channel. He's just released a video which discusses all the various models when it comes to the September through November period here. So he kind of goes through each individual model, whether it be Meteo France, the Canadian model, the US generated models, the ECMWF, the Met Office. He looks into each individual model run and discusses that. So he goes into more detail on what I'm going to go into in this video. So I do encourage you to check out Gavin Partridge on Gav's Weather Vids and have a watch of that, because he definitely produces some terrific stuff frequently. If you're not a subscriber, please do subscribe to his channel. I greatly encourage you to do that. But in the kind of short term, actually things are getting a little bit more interesting. Now, the Arctic Oscillation and the North Atlantic Oscillation is, as you can see here, expected to go into negative territory, and the modelling is showing high pressure building somewhat to the west over the Atlantic and also to the north. Also, the NAO, as you can see here, also trending negative. Now, if only it was a couple of months down the road and we would be talking about colder conditions potentially with this type of setup. So, a lot of warm water stacked up within the northern ocean basins, including the North Atlantic. That can do two things, and we've already seen that taking place. It can produce wetter conditions. It can also produce drier conditions. So, pinpointing the type of autumn season that we're going to see this year is actually quite difficult, and the CFSV2 is a model that I quite often show you. It also tends to have somewhat of a warm bias. By that I mean it shows almost a red paint bomb not only over Europe but across much of the northern hemisphere. And you can see here during the September through November period, so this is the meteorological autumn, of course, and it's quite interesting what it's showing. So it's showing above normal heights through the North Atlantic. No surprise really given the abnormally warm sea surface temperatures, but interestingly enough, it shows a ridge extension from the mid-Atlantic up into Greenland here, and actually a negative, or a kind of neutral height field to the north of the British Isles and over Scandinavia, as well as over Iceland. That would tend to correlate to lower pressure over this region here. So basically, low pressure over Scandinavia, high pressure further south. That would be a fairly, a fairly positive North Atlantic Oscillation signal. Also, it would produce a relatively wet pattern overall as well, a fairly westerly driven pattern and a fairly Atlantic driven pattern as well. And you can see here for the 3 month period, it's actually shown wetter than normal. But if you watch Gavin's video in his video yesterday, it actually shows that the majority of the models are indicating drier and indeed warmer than normal for the autumn season here. But of course, you have to break it down into individual months, and as he says, and as I would say myself, yes, you might have the 3 month period overall that may be wetter or indeed drier than normal, warmer or cooler than normal. The overall breakdown in each individual month can be quite different. You could have a wet month in amongst 2 dry months, which means that, of course, the average it tends to be on the drier than normal theme. But you could have a wet September, you could have a wet October, or a wet November. And I think as we start to see the atmosphere cooling over that abnormally warm water, I think we're going to start to increase the chance of seeing rainfall. And it's going to be interesting to see how much that warm water can influence the atmosphere. And, do we get early season cold shots into the western portion of Europe? If we do see colder shots into Western Europe, how much of an influence does that warmer than normal water have on the British Isles and indeed Europe overall? That is going to be the big question. Because sometimes in these big warm seasons, we've seen it in 2010 actually, especially over Russia, record-breaking hot conditions. The following winter was extremely cold. Sometimes you can get this kind of rubber band effect where there's a kind of snap from extreme heat to all of a sudden extreme cold. So that is another aspect that we need to watch here. And of course, when we're in the period at the moment between solar minimum and solar maximum, you can get these wild back and forths in extremes. But certainly in the near term, both the Arctic Oscillation and the North Atlantic Oscillation look as if it's going to go into negative territory here. Looking at the 500 millibars for the month of September, and it's quite interesting as well because we've seen quite a back and forth, by the way, between unusually dry conditions for the month of September, but it's also indicating potentially wetter conditions as well. So, your guess is potentially as good as mine when it comes to whether it's going to be a drier month or indeed a wetter month. My hunch would be that the further north you go, so i.e. Scotland, Northern Ireland, we could see a relatively wet autumn coming up, and it may be harder to get wetter conditions the further south you go where it has been driest. But again, the atmosphere has a tendency to kind of fool you. You may think it's going to do something and it does the complete opposite. Of course, the winter forecast is a good example of that, thinking that all the parameters are coming together for a cold winter, and it does quite literally the opposite. So we need to be careful, and so it's a little bit of a jury's out, so to speak, when it comes to the overall setup here. So we've seen these back and forth between wetter than normal and indeed drier than normal for the month of September. The latest CFSV2 is indicating a neutral to negative heights over Europe. So this is the UK and Ireland, of course. We've got a little bit of a kind of negative NAO signal, if you notice here, where the core of the ridge is actually over the central North Atlantic, extending up into Greenland here. And that is very interesting indeed. Looking at the precipitation for the month of September, and you can see it's actually wetter than normal around the British Isles, around France, places that really need to see the rain. So this would certainly be good to see. But interestingly enough, the model also has a warmer than normal September overall. And then, of course, as you go into the month of October, it is warmer than normal. The month of November, warmer than normal. So you get the overall idea. And notice here the widespread area of warmer than normal. And this is the problem. That is just simply not going to happen. We know that's not going to be happening because we've seen this time and time again where everything is warmer than normal, and like literally that doesn't happen, folks. even if we do have warmer than normal in our region of the world. And looking at precipitation, it's quite interesting. CFSV2 for the month of October is, indeed wetter than normal across Scotland, drier than normal across England. That's quite interesting to see. And then, of course, for the month of November, it's wetter than normal. So, is the atmosphere going to respond to the abnormally warm waters around the North Atlantic and surrounding the British Isles through the Mediterranean basin, through the Baltic Sea? That is going to be the big golden question indeed. Looking at the Met Office here, forecast for the month of September through November. You can see here it has positive heights within the mid and low latitudes. We've got negative heights up towards Iceland and Greenland, so that would be a fairly positive NAO signal. Wettest in the north, driest in the south. We can have a look at even the period following that, which is of course October, November and December. It's indicating positive heights across the North Atlantic extending up into Greenland. A little bit of negative here to the north of the UK, but that looks relatively mild overall and Atlantic driven. And November through January period, still we've got that positive height field across the North Atlantic extending from Canada all the way to the British Isles here. So rather interesting, of course. Looking at the precipitation, you can see here, if we get back to the upcoming autumn season, looks as if wettest across the north, driest across the south. So a fairly classic west to east flow off the Atlantic across the top, so to speak here. Looking at the period between October through December, you can see here driest across the south, wettest across the north here. So again, a very zonal westerly flow, and as we get into the meat of the winter season, still very similar in terms of precipitation. Looking at the tubular temperature anomaly here for the September through November period, warmer than normal is the name of the game. Cooler than normal up towards Iceland here. The period between October and December, again very warm compared to normal here, and of course once we get into the heart of the winter season, it's indicating warmer than normal as well here. So the jury is still very much out when it comes to the overall idea. Looking at the CFSV2 weeklies here, this is upcoming 7-day period. Strongest heights to the north, we've got a negative off Iberia, so therefore we have got a fairly dry setup here to the north. We've got wetter than normal conditions, alpine region extending through France and into the north of Iberia. Second week, so week 2, 8 to 14, notice here that we're starting to increase precipitation across the UK and across France here. Driest across the north and Iberia. Looking at the 500 millibar height anomaly chart here, you can see here the negative actually situated over the Celtic Sea, surrounded by high pressure overall. And then even in the week 3, which takes in the period 10th through 17th of September, we've got a pretty strong area of high pressure over the continent, extending up to the west of the British Isles here. Precipitation for that week looks to be average conditions, and even as we go towards the second half of September, driest across more southern portions, kind of neutral across the British Isles, with the exceptions of wetter than normal across the north of Scotland here. But yeah, it's going to be a very interesting time as we go towards the September period here. Exactly what happens. Drier than normal, wetter than normal. The jury is still out on that one, folks. But keep it right here on my YouTube channel. We'll continue to watch this as we go forward, and I'll talk more and more about the upcoming autumn and winter. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Hope you're enjoying the bank holiday weekend. If it's, England, Wales, and is Northern Ireland, I think, included in that? I know Scotland isn't. But I hope you're having a good day and a good weekend thus far. Hopefully, be back again tomorrow with more. Bye for now.